co-regional representatives for the Guaranteed Livable Income Network of the United Church of Canada, which is the sponsor for this event, along with the assistance from the Eastern Ontario Outaouais Regional Council, and especially from Anita Jansman, who maybe is up in your corner, who's the council staff member and been invaluable in getting tonight organized and will be the technical host. So the United Church of Canada has been working to promote a guaranteed livable income since 1972. So it's hard to believe that next year that will have been for 50 years. So a GLI, or the Guaranteed Livable Income, is a payment to individuals or families by government that ensures that everyone has adequate income to cover the cost of basic necessities. This means that all people can live with dignity regardless of their work status. And the COVID crisis certainly made clear that many of us are vulnerable to loss of income, at least at some time in our lives. Such a program as GLI would be part of the national fabric of services that preserves and protects all Canadians, or as Jesus put it, to love our neighbors as ourselves. So as we get started, Anita, maybe do you want to talk about how we will handle questions and maybe mute everybody?
Okay, so hi everybody. My name is Anita. You have to be a little bit patient with me. I've never had a meeting this big before, so this is pretty amazing for me. So anyway, I would suggest that you, if your connection does not feel stable, it does help if you turn your video off. So all we'll see is your name or your picture. So except for the presenters, that does help. If you want to get a stable connection, turn your video off. Also, I just ask that everyone mute themselves unless they are speaking, please, because we just don't want a lot of background noise coming from another part of your house. The other thing I'm going to tell you is that there will be a chat, question and answer towards the end of this presentation. So I'm going to handle the questions by chat. So if you have a question, as Jamie and Elaine are speaking, send a message in the chat and I will record it, and I'll ask the questions at the end of the meeting, okay? Does anybody have any questions about the technical part of this? Is everybody comfortable, ready to go? Okay, all right, thank you.
Yeah, okay, well, thank you, Anita. And tonight we are very honored that we have the Very Reverend Lois M. Wilson, who's co-chair of the United Church's GLI network, that has agreed to open our program. Lois is very well known, having been the first woman moderator of the United Church of Canada and later a senator. She's also served as president of both the Canadian Council of Churches and the World Council of Churches. Over the last number of years, she has been working tirelessly to promote a basic income. And we're delighted to welcome Reverend Wilson to our event.
Thank
Lois?
you. I'm delighted to be part of it. And I'm impressed by the number of people you've got on this call and the strong support you're giving to this movement. I had a call last September from the National United Church saying that, it's been our church policy as stated since 72. We tried to get in 86. But the method was to pass a resolution of the General Council and send it to Ottawa, and precisely nothing happened. So they decided to try a different model, which is to animate and bring into being a network of United Church people across the country who would take this on as a responsibility, and that's why we're here tonight. We now have contacts in every province in Canada, but there are great swaths of Canada that we still have no representatives. So I would urge any of you who know a nearby church who is not involved to phone them up and tell them what's going on and recruit them and get them to recruit somebody else, because that's how networks work. Mm-hmm. So congratulations on tonight. I think it's going to be a very interesting evening. And thanks very much for your support for the network.
Well, thank you so much, Lois. Goodness, what you have done has really been an inspiration for those close to 50 years now. So now I turn to Clarke to begin our program.
Well, friends, let us now center our thoughts toward those unfortunate neighbors living in poverty across Canada. Tonight's program will lead us to reflect on how much community justice could evolve if the government implemented a guaranteed livable income. You know, with adequate income, people become healthier, as shown in the introduction by Dr. Danielle Martin in the book we are discussing tonight. This means fewer demands on our healthcare system, along with less petty crime. And we would become more trusting of each other, and there would be more community engagement. All these are good, and these and more changes would markedly improve the well-being of our Canadian society within a few years. That is worth working for, and we have just the people to start us on the path to implementation of a living income. Our format tonight is panelists with a moderator. Our moderator is Joe Gunn, who has led social justice ministries for Catholic Archdiocese in Western Canada and religious congregations of both men and women. He was executive director of the ecumenical charity Citizens for Public Justice, as well as served at 11 years as director of the Office of Social Affairs for the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops. For 7 years, Joe worked in Central America. He grew up in Toronto, but he has said, luckily, he got over that infliction and is currently director of the Center Oblat at a Voice of Justice located at St. Paul University. He tells me he is good friends with Elaine and Jamie, which we've already gathered, I'm sure. And he says, hopefully that won't change, even if the questions he asks seem too difficult. Over to you, Joe.
Thanks very kindly, Ellie and Clarke, and thanks to everyone who had a hand in organizing this evening. I especially want to thank Lois for the work she's done for years. And I think it's not a coincidence that I think it's over 50 senators have signed on a letter supporting a call for basic income in Canada, which I think is part of Lois's work, but also shows us that maybe the Senate can help move some issues like these along. So I'd like to begin this evening by not only thanking everyone who's involved, but introducing to you a little bit Jamie and Elaine. They are the authors of this wonderful book, The Case for Basic Income. And I want to start off right from the beginning by saying, if you haven't had a chance to pick up this book, you can get it at a bookstore, but you could also go online to BTL Books, Between the Lines Books, btlbooks.com, and you can see it there. You'll find the authors very interesting. Jamie's been an author of about a dozen books, and somehow he keeps at it. He has worked as a journalist at CBC. He's won prizes for his award-winning writing. You would say perhaps that Jamie is an accomplished scribbler, but I think that he's perhaps better known in Kingston for being an activist. He worked for some time with the Sisters of Providence, encouraging social justice and ecological justice activities in the city. And Elaine Power is a professor actually at Queen's University, where she's head of the Department of Gender Studies. She's a mom. She's a founding member of the Kingston Action Group for Basic Income Guarantee. And I must say that thanks to Elaine, this book really turned out to be a much better project that Jamie ever would have been able to do on his own. So I'm going to ask Elaine and Jamie to give us a little bit of an introduction to the book, and then maybe I'll be able to pose some questions to them, which will whet your appetite. And then, as has been mentioned by Anita, after you hear them, you might care to put a question into the chat, and we'll see if we have enough time to get to quite a few of those. So welcome, Jamie and Elaine, and maybe we'll start with Elaine. You'd like to make a short presentation of the book, please.
Sure. Thank you so much, Joe. And thank you all for coming, and Ellie and Clarke for organizing, and Anita for supporting us, and especially to Reverend Wilson. I remember actually when I first met her in 1981 in Halifax, when I was an undergraduate student, when she was the first woman moderator of the United Church. I feel quite humbled by the fact that she's been doing this work for 50 years. I've written out a presentation that I'll talk about, but I've always thought of basic income as such a no-brainer that when I started doing this work in 2013, I thought, well, surely we'll have a basic income within a few years. So maybe we should actually ask Reverend Wilson some questions about how to maintain optimism for 50 years, because that's one of my let's say a growing edge for me. So my interest in basic income really has come from doing years of research on poverty and food insecurity, and also from teaching for 15 years of teaching a first-year course at Queen's in the social determinants of health. And probably all of you know that's a course that is about the big social factors like racism and colonialism and poverty and housing and how that impacts our health. So I've had the great privilege of teaching literally thousands of young people about those bigger factors that affect health rather than the more traditional lifestyle factors. And it's really not an accident that until recently, healthcare professionals have been among the strongest champions of basic income, because we've known for actually a few thousand years that some groups of people live longer than others. At the population level, income and longevity are closely linked. So I'd like to read a couple of paragraphs from the section of the book entitled Measuring Health by Postal Code, starting on page 147. There's a street in Hamilton called Upper Paradise Road. It forms one of the boundaries of a West Mountain neighborhood. And while the name is surely a bit of hyperbole, it is genuinely a realtor's delight. At the other end of the spectrum is a North End neighborhood bounded on the west by Wellington Street North. One apartment on that street was listed in 2019 on the Rent It or Not rating site as faring poorly on the cockroach meter, with one tenant posting a graphic firsthand account of cohabitating with the undesirable creatures. Hamilton seems like it was designed by a sociologist to prove a theory, its class divisions sharply delineated. Anyone inclined to skepticism could turn to the local paper's Code Red series. It began in 2010 when Hamilton Spectator investigative journalist Steve Buist launched a remarkably lengthy and insightful investigation into how health and illness can be measured, not simply in individual terms, but on a broad social scale, underlining the impact of poverty by postal code. There's no clearer measure of health than whether you're dead or alive, Buist wrote in the first of dozens of stories that the Spec published in its initial Code Red series. In the West Mountain neighborhood bounded by Upper Paradise Road, postal code L9C 5B7, life expectancy was 86.3 years. Down around Wellington Street North, postal code L8R 1M9, hard by the waterfront, the average was 65.5 years, just ahead of Pakistan, but worse than India or Turkmenistan. That's more than 20 years difference in life expectancy by postal code. And although this information is shocking, it's really not new. So I'd like to read another little part. Let's see, explaining what the German philosopher Friedrich Engels produced in his book, The Conditions of the Working Class in England, 1844. And he connected the exploitation of workers and their gruesome living and working conditions to their high rates of disease and shortened lifespans. So this is 1844. You'll find that there's a lot of resonance to our contemporary world. Working class people lived in overcrowded, dilapidated housing, suffering from inadequate diets featuring contaminated food, drank alcohol to avoid contaminated water, lacked sanitation, worked horrendously long hours in dangerous factories, and had neither medical care nor access to education. Infectious diseases like cholera and typhus were rampant. Citing official reports, Engels wrote that the average working class lifespan in Liverpool was only 15 years, less than half that of the upper class. He accused the rich and powerful of social murder for ignoring the dangerous and unhealthy conditions in the fast-growing industrial cities that were the source of their fortunes. He says, "I've never seen a class so incurably debased by selfishness, so corroded within, so incapable of progress as the English bourgeoisie." Well, poor Engels must be rolling over in his grave because the English bourgeoisie has some competition these days. So as I said, when I co-founded the Kingston Action Group for a Basic Income Guarantee, that's going to be 8 years next month, basic income just seemed like such a no-brainer. We have a lot of evidence already to support the benefits of basic income, and surely government policy is informed by evidence. Even before the ill-fated, I see Reverend Wilson's laughing. Maybe not. Even before the ill-fated Ontario basic income pilot, surely we had all the evidence we needed to set out to eliminate poverty and the horrifying indignities created by our perverse, dysfunctional, Kafkaesque social assistance system that was created on the basis of 19th century stereotypes of the poor. I remember one of the older members of our group looking at me. He snorted and said, "I don't think we'll see basic income in my lifetime." Even recognizing my naivety, I still hold on to some shreds of hope that Bill, this member of our group, will be proven wrong. Fast forward to the pandemic and the implementation of the CERB, a kind of basic income, even if not what we wanted. Surely CERB also provided all the evidence we needed and more. It also raised public awareness about basic income to unprecedented levels. But as the pandemic dragged on and hopes of implementing a permanent CERB for everyone faded, I started to lose hope. In the spring, at the height of a devastating third wave, public health advocates called for paid sick days for all workers, surely another no-brainer in the midst of an unprecedented pandemic. If workers had a basic income and could leave their poorly paid, unsafe workplaces without fear of hunger or homelessness, then surely they would have paid sick time, better wages, and safer working conditions. And there's the rub. That's exactly why we don't have basic income. So the new, more cynical, less naive me is having to switch my mindset to the long game. This is where I need to chat with Reverend Wilson to recognize the power relations and how threatening basic income is to the status quo. It will take a lot more struggle and a lot more mobilization. Maybe we need a new Tommy Douglas. So I'm trying to follow the advice of Buddhist ecologist Joanna Macy, who has this concept that she calls active hope. And she says to engage in active hope is to assess the situation as clearly as you can, to figure out the best course of action in the context of that situation, and then to follow that course of action without being attached to the outcome. Maybe Bill Cooper is right and we won't have basic income in his lifetime, or maybe even not in my lifetime. But we know that basic income is a no-brainer, a worthy, sensible, important, critical, and essential component of a more just future for all. And we won't stop struggling for it. And Joe actually sent us an email yesterday, maybe, that Pope Francis has also endorsed basic income. So we know that good people in the world understand how sensible this is. So I listened recently to a podcast interview with a woman named Valerie Quar. She's a Sikh woman and a human rights lawyer in the United States. And she has a new book called Revolutionary Love. And at the end, when she's responding to the interviewer's question about how to live a good life, she says, to be enraptured by the world is to live a good life. Sorry, to be enraptured by the world as it is to live a good life. To labor for the world as it ought to be is to live a good life. We may not see the fruits of our labor in our lifetime. We labor for a future we may not see. And so what does it mean to have a labor as an end in and of itself? When I show up to the labor with love, then my labor becomes porous enough to let breath in and to let joy in. Laboring for a more just world with love and with joy is a meaning of life, the meaning of a good life. So I hope you enjoy the book. It's dedicated to the 4,000 courageous people who took a chance on the Ontario Basic Income pilot and whose good faith hopes were shattered when our current Conservative government arbitrarily and prematurely canceled it. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jamie, and I look forward to your questions, Joe.
And those questions from the audience. Thanks a lot, Elaine. I've written a bunch of books in collaboration with others, although the word collaboration seems to be a bit tainted, so you don't want to go too far down that road. One thinks of World War II, post-World War II France and the fate of the various collaborators. Anyway, the first book I did with another person, and this explains in part how I fell in with the Roman Church over the last 40 years on and off, was with Michael Cherney, who worked on this book with me called Getting Started on Social Analysis. It was originally supposed to be for parish social action groups, but by accident it turned into a university textbook, and it sold tens and tens of thousands of copies. Unfortunately, the Jesuits got the royalties. So I've had to continue toiling away as a scribbler. You can see my books in the back. Elaine has books too. Just by way of introduction, my collaboration with Elaine has been extremely rewarding. I've learned a lot. I've had a good time. She's one of the most passionately committed social justice advocates who I've ever met. So I thought I'd start off by talking briefly about a study that recently appeared in the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine about how Canada's suicide rate dropped by nearly a third in the first year of the pandemic. And Dr. Robert McIntyre, who is one of the principal authors, a professor of psychiatry and pharmacology at U of T, described this finding as remarkable. And he also cited government financial benefits. Elaine has mentioned the CERB, and today the Trudeau government cut back a few of those benefits. That Dr. McIntyre said he thought that was important in creating a sense of security with respect to economic, housing, and health stress. And as we know, and Elaine can talk about this later, stress is very important social determinant of health. Basic income advocates will no doubt be citing this study as we continue with our advocacy work. So I think I just thought I'd start off with that just tiny little bit of data. And so one of the things about our book is that unlike many of the books, and there's shelves of them now about basic income, all important, published around the world, our book tries to approach this issue, this important issue, by telling stories. So it's a standard journalistic device. If you want to get an idea across, it's important to find people and places and use them as prisms, if you will, through which important issues are reflected. So that's, about half of our book is about people we met, Elaine and I, in Lindsay and Hamilton, Ontario, who had been on the basic income pilot. And I was pleased that when Elaine referred to the cancellation of the pilot, that she did not say extremely rude things about the Premier of Ontario. I have witnessed this in a public forum, these rude things being said by Elaine, and she's, I guess, pulled back from that, but it has not diluted her passion, shall we say. So the story that I'll tell begins, of course, once upon a time. Once upon a time, banks designed their buildings to impress the clients in the same way that the medieval church designed cathedrals to impress the masses, showing how solid and trustworthy these institutions are. Soaring ceilings, polished marble. So if you go down to downtown Hamilton on Gore Park, you'll find the main office of Scotiabank, formerly the Bank of Nova Scotia. And that's this desire to impress was something that Scotiabank had in mind when it built the building. Lots of marble. It's 1940s or 50s. It's not, doesn't go way back like Bay Street banks and St. James Street banks in Montreal. And though the words Bank of Nova Scotia are still carved in stone, literally, above the sidewalk on the street, the eye is instead drawn to a shiny red plastic logo, and it says Scotiabank. So the Bank of Nova Scotia has now disappeared since its place. It's moved obviously from Halifax, and when they changed to Scotiabank, it was all about the flash and grab of marketing and try to impress as many people as possible, establish your brand. So that was part of the Bank of Nova Scotia. Scotiabank's campaign 3 or 4 years ago, when it purchased the naming rights for the hockey rink and basketball place where Toronto's professional sports teams play. So it's now called the Scotiabank Arena. And I don't know if anybody can guess how much the Bank of Nova Scotia paid for those naming rights. If you do, why don't you put it in the chat, and I'll come back to it a bit later on once Anita gives me the high sign about the Bank of Nova Scotia naming right guessing contest. So my story begins, having set the context of place, with that of a person, a young man named James Kalura. He arrived at his first real job, having gone to university, done summer jobs, but his first permanent job at the Bank of Nova Scotia downtown on Gore Park. And he figured that Scotiabank would be the first step on the financial sector's career ladder. James's father had been, still is, I think, the general manager of the co-op credit union where people working in Hamilton's hospitals and healthcare sectors put their deposits. So during his first 5 years as a bank teller, he made just over the minimum wage. He was getting paid, he said, about the same as somebody who was flipping burgers. He got benefits. He certainly readily admitted that in an appreciative manner, but he was still clocking in just under 30 hours a week. So that's typical of the precarious nature of work in today's job market. They call it precarity or insecurity. And also, of course, at the front of this bank branch, there's the automated teller machines, the ATMs, and they have for decades been displacing tellers. But by the time James Kalura started at the bank, electronic banking and smartphone apps had also arrived, and he watched the lineups in front of his teller's wicket start to get shorter. Kalura knew that he was meant to spur this trend, to make sure those lineups kept getting shorter. An important part of his job was to persuade customers not to use his services. He told me that the better he performed, the less relevant he was. So this is the effect of technology on labor. And the indicator of a job well done was making his own job more insecure by something that the bank called his digital conversion rate. And so this is, a sort of a case study in what's happening in the labor market and the job market. Kalura also recalled something else. Now, Gore Park in downtown Hamilton, the sidewalks are crowded with people who are unhoused, people who are desperate, people in walkers, people in wheelchairs, people smoking, et cetera, lots of beggars, lots of people calling out to each other and perhaps calling out to themselves. It is quite a desperate situation that we see in other urban centers in Canada, I'm sure in Ottawa too. And he remarked to me, and I'll just quote him, "As I counted the coins emptied from the hats and cups of homeless customers onto the bank's imported Italian marble countertops, I had plenty of time to think about how we as a society could better provide for the mentally ill, the sick, the poor, and the precariously or underemployed." And James also was always wondering, of course, how long his job would last, when he was going to get laid off if he did his job well, the robotization of work. So in 2017, he applied for the Ontario Basic Income pilot. He was part of the pilot. And I think it's important here to note, and Elaine has spoken of it, and I think the folks who are listening in on this, focused generally on basic income as an anti-poverty and social justice measure, which it is, very much so. But Kalura wasn't on social assistance. He came from a solid middle-class background. He had no disability. He wasn't a single parent struggling to make ends meet. He was simply a young guy frustrated with dull, dead-end labor. And he figured he had little or no, and he figured that the labor had little or no social value because, of course, he was being paid to get rid of himself. So he quit. He quit the bank. Horrors. Now, if you look at the book, you read through the book, there's an interesting anecdote of a dust-up that happened when James was denounced by a zealous columnist from the Toronto Sun. But I won't say any more than that. It's an interesting anecdote. So basic income done right, we think it would be a modest step towards what we call the democratization of prosperity at a time when inequality is on the rise here in Canada. It might allow us to see leisure as the fruit of economic progress. Now, people who are opposed to basic income, like our friend, the columnist in the Toronto Sun, hold it out as a free pass for free riders, but it's not a trip to the couch after a stop at the beer store. The fact is, though, the very idea of basic income is shocking to some people. And I think those of us who are advocates for basic income have to keep this in mind, that many people immediately react to say, oh, if you give them a basic income, they're just going to loaf. They'll be free riders. And it's an economic concept. But if you think about free riders, how about those who benefit from poverty level wages paid to people, mainly women who do undervalued essential work, child rearing, elder care, cleaning? Aren't the free riders really the people who enjoy the benefits of having racialized newcomers look after their parents and their grandparents? So I think when you think about the idea of free riders and loafers, et cetera, I think you got to look at it a bit through that lens. Some people regard separating labor from income, which is what basic income does. And I suspect that most of the people on this call are in receipt of a basic income themselves. I am. It's called the Canada Pension Plan and the Old Age Security. And if you're in real need, the Guaranteed Income Supplement. So we all get the basic income, those of us who are over 60 or 65. But I don't think we're all loafing and heading for the couch after a visit to the beer store. Some people regard, again, the separation of labor from income as offensive. They regard wage labor as some sort of moral imperative. On the other hand, people like Kalura and Elaine and myself are attracted by the idea of freedom from labor. We see basic income as a common sense idea, and it's part of a move, I think, to desacralize labor. So we see the difference between labor, which is something you buy and sell on the market, and work, something that might be willingly or enthusiastically undertaken when we look after each other, when we do volunteer work in the community, in faith communities, and so on. So James Kalura had become disenchanted with this ethic of speed and performance. He left the bank and he found himself a more enjoyable and fulfilling job. So it was about a newfound freedom, and not necessarily personal freedom, but freedom to play things safe. Elaine and I have come to the conclusion that's one of the big selling points of basic income. It allows people to maybe unhook themselves from the sort of squirrel cage of the labor market. And I think maybe I've got lots more I could say, as Elaine knows, but I'll just read what James said. One of the things he said to me, I interviewed him 3 times. Basic income gave me the time to take a deep breath. It gave me a freedom to explore where I really wanted to be, a sense of freedom and the ability to make new choices that I didn't have before. So I'll just leave it at there, and maybe I can get in some of my other things that I've jotted down in the Q&A period. Thank you.
Well, thanks to both of you for introducing this terrific book. I think all of us participating this evening get a sense of it. The book really, to me, has two parts that fit together quite well, and something that doesn't exist in every book on basic income. There are the arguments for and debunking of some of the arguments against, but there's also the personal stories, the stories that Jamie recounted of James in Hamilton, or Jody Dean, a single mom struggling away, or in Lindsay Tracy, all with different kinds of situations and how a basic income really worked. So I think it would be important for all of us to keep in mind that this mid-2018 announcement of a basic income pilot in Ontario, which was killed in 2019 after only about 8 months, I think we're really indebted to both of the authors for bringing us some good learning from that, and putting it in a way that allows those of us that aren't policy wonks to not only read positions on basic income and arguments for it, but also real stories of real people. So I want to propose a couple of questions here. Maybe I'll start with Jamie, and then I have a couple of questions, and then people are, I think, going to start to put their own questions in the chat as the conversation goes forward. But perhaps the first question, Jamie, if you could just suggest to us, the book came out in early 2021. There is a small mention, of course, of the what you call the plague hitting us. How has the pandemic changed our view? And you did mention today, we hear the news that the government is phasing out this CRB. So what has really changed in your mind? And how have we begun to think differently about basic income because of what we learned in the government response to the pandemic?
Well, I think that the arrival of the CERB, the CERB, in April of 2020 gave those of us who were basic income advocates some hope that this could be done. It was essentially an unconditional payment, although it's very important to point out that it explicitly excluded people who had not been, quote unquote, labor market participants over the previous year. So people who were on social assistance and disability did not qualify for the CERB, even though they are arguably the people who need it most. But that said, all of a sudden, something happened that millions of Canadians began to receive unconditional payments because, for reasons that had nothing to do with their individual character or behavior, the government was suddenly able to help out. And this ran contrary to what Elaine and I call in the book market fundamentalism, that period of post-1980 when the ideas of neoliberalism or market fundamentalism took hold and guided government's policy for 40, 50 years nearly. All of a sudden, that consensus started to show serious cracks, to the extent that the Financial Times magazine or newspaper, which is the world's business paper of record, wrote an editorial in early April 2020 saying that all of a sudden ideas that had been considered completely unorthodox, completely wacky, like basic income, had now become not centerpieces, if you will, but certainly much, much more acceptable. So I think what I call the plague, the pandemic, did provide an opening, a crack through which different kinds of hope, the kinds of hope that Elaine mentioned. We quote the Leonard Cohen song Anthem about when cracks appear, that's where the light comes in. Great song. And I think that, we have seen the support for basic income increase, I wouldn't say exponentially, but there's been a real surge in support for basic income, even though governments federally, obviously provincially in Ontario, and even in British Columbia are still very, very resistant to basic income. But the short answer to your question, Joe, is yes, it does provide a crack through which the light can come in. And it's up to those of us who are supporting basic income to take advantage of that and move ahead with it.
Okay, thanks, Jimmy. Elaine, let me ask you a question. I'm not going to ask Jamie to sing like Leonard Cohen, but much less I notice that he often has in the book, take this job and shove it. So we're not going to ask him to sing that song, but I'll move on to you, Elaine. One wonderful thing about Elaine is that you all have to know is she loves food banks. And even before the pandemic, like almost 4.5 million Canadians were food insecure. But, Jamie mentioned some of us already can receive, if you're over 60 or 65, the OAS, the GIS, and that food insecurity rates drop for folks when they are able to access those things. I wanted to give you a chance, Elaine, to tell us what you're thinking about food insecurity and that whole role of basic income and addressing that huge problem in Canada.
Well, thanks for that opening, Joe. Food banks are kind of in the same category as Doug Ford, so I'm not a fan. And And that's nothing against all the really good-hearted people who volunteer in food banks, who, was church people who set up food banks in the 1980s. And many of the people on this call probably remember that they were meant to be temporary when they started in the early 1980s. They were an emergency response to an economic downturn. And here we are 40 years later. The first one was set up literally in 1981 in Edmonton after a visit from an American who, I think it's an American model of addressing poverty. Sorry, I'm going on a rant, Joe. What was your question?
Well, I wanted to give you the chance because you've done so much work in that area.
Okay, so there are two main problems that with food banks. One is that most people who are food insecure never go to a food bank. So as you said, over 4 million people before the pandemic were food insecure. That includes 1.2 million children. Most of those families never go to the food bank. So we've set them up thinking that, they will help people not be hungry. But for a whole variety of reasons, most people never go. We know statistically from surveys that about 1 in 4 or maybe 1 in 5 families will go to the food bank. And the other problem is that even when they do go, they're still food insecure. So we know that food insecurity is a really visible manifestation of poverty, and it's a very sensitive marker of deprivation. So thinking that we can provide food as a way to solve this problem, well, A, it's way too big, and putting one more can of soup in the bin at the grocery store isn't going to help. And it really, as kind and as good-hearted as those who donate are, it's still not going to fix the problem. So we need basic income. The only thing that's been shown to actually reduce food insecurity is income. So that's why I'm an advocate for basic income. So I think unfortunately what food banks have done is they give us a sense of comfort. They kind of give us an illusion unintentionally, but they've become almost like a smokescreen. And it keeps us from holding governments to account. Keeps us from putting government's feet to the fire and saying we have to tackle the roots of this, not just put a Band-Aid on it. So thank you for that opportunity, Joe. And do you think, could I ask Reverend Wilson a question about what she, after watching this for 50 years and watching the resurgence of it, I guess I want to know two things. Is like, how do you maintain hope for such a long time? And what do you think, are there things that, what do we need to be doing to make this a reality before Bill Cooper dies, before you die, before I die, in our lifetimes? What do we need to do to make this a reality?
Well, briefly, we belong to a community rooted in social justice, cutting on the Old Testament prophets like Amos and Isaiah, and then Jesus. So, justice for everybody is a keynote of our identity as a people. So we do it because of who we are, not because we think it's going to succeed or fail, but that's what we have to do. And that's why I'm still at it, because to not do that is to deny that I belong to Christian community. And I think that's the first thing. It defines our community. Second thing is we don't know whether it'll succeed or not. But we do it anyway because that's the mandate. How long did it take to get Medicare? A long time. So we need people who will commit themselves to this and get their children committed and talk to neighboring churches and talk to other secular groups that are doing this, and there are quite a few, and keep at it. But I just like to say, we don't do it because it's a little project. It defines who we are as Christians.
Thank you. Thank you for indulging me, Joe.
Oh, not at all, not at all.
One with the 20% off.
So I realize I'm going to give us about 5 minutes more, and then we'll move on to questions from participants and so on. But I do have two questions. Maybe you can split them up. One question is, we had planned earlier this evening to have lovely young people from the Basic Income Youth Network to speak, and that just wasn't possible because of an illness. But let me say that we know young people are super concerned about a green future. How can a basic income, which would probably improve the possibilities for all kinds of people to be able to spend more, how can we link a basic income, more just social future to the green future that all of us also want? And the second question would be, I don't know, maybe Jamie, you prefer to look at this one if Elaine takes a shot at this one, but maybe just for all of us that are wondering about next steps after the book. In the next 100 days of a new federal government, is that where we should be focusing, and what should we try to do at that level? Or your book kind of deals with the situation in Ontario, doesn't it? We're going to have an election before June of 2022 in Ontario. Are there things we should be looking at one level or another that would things that you'd like to share with the group of 75 of us that are here about next steps? So
Shall I try to deal with your question first, Joe, and then we can toss it back to Elaine, because the question about the link between green politics and social justice politics it's quite tricky. So she's the professor, I'm a mere scribbler, so I'll stick with the easy one. Well, it's not easy. What is to be done next? I think we just have to redouble our efforts. We shouldn't get, as Reverend Wilson said, shouldn't get discouraged. We have to maintain hope. I think one of the things that the basic income movement needs to do, or might consider doing, I don't want to sound too prescriptive, is to move the demand or the request or the pushing for basic income away from it simply as an anti-poverty effort. Because I remember when I worked for the Sisters of Providence, I was part of the Interchurch Social Assistance Reform Coalition here in Ontario. At election time, speaking of elections, we'd get out there and stick signs in the lawn saying, let's vote for a poverty-free Ontario. It was a good effort. It was a sincere effort, but it didn't really do very much, because I think we have to confront the really important fact that in politics, poverty is not really a huge top of mind issue for most voters. Most voters are concerned about stuff that affects them directly, and thank God most Canadians don't live in poverty. So I think we have to think about how to expand the reach of the basic income push to include people like James Kalura, whose job was insecure, who himself was stressed by working at this terrible job, and pitch it or show that basic income can appeal to people, particularly, and it's important, you mentioned this, Joe, people in a younger cohort who are feeling very insecure about the future of getting by here in Canada with respect to, say, the cost of housing. There's an example of market failure right there. The cost of food, we've seen a lot in the past couple of weeks about the rise of inflation, and that affects people in the middle. And I think it's very, very important for those of us who are enthusiastic about basic income not to get away from promoting it as an anti-poverty tool, but to show how it can make the lives of a broader public more secure, particularly younger people. So I think that, we have to realize that, as Elena said, promoting basic income is a long game. And as anybody who's been involved in politics knows, that the political cycle is an electoral cycle. The business cycle is an annual cycle, and we have to try to impress upon a broader public that we have to start to think long-term. And I think that is a good segue into the question of the increasing tragic climate, I like to call it climate breakdown. I don't think climate chaos is good enough. I don't think global warming or heating is good enough. I think it's climate breakdown. And I think that word does it. And I thought I'll just close this little rant with a quote from John Lanchester that I noticed in the London Review of Books 2 or 3 years ago. He was supporting basic income, explaining it in a really good article. And he asked the question, quote, "Will we be fine with the rich taking a bigger and bigger share of total income until the end of time as the world drowns and burns and sucks?" So, I mean, that's a bit sobering, but I think that's the kind of choice we're up against. So over to Elaine.
Thanks, Jamie. In terms of the environment and basic income, you know, at one level, it's a policy option. As you know, as Jamie has said, we need to think about it beyond poverty. It enables people to make different choices about their lives. But to me, the bigger potential for basic income and its connection to, it's not just climate breakdown, it's planetary breakdown. You know, it's loss of biodiversity, it's, you know, extinction of species, and on it goes. To me, the philosophical connection is perhaps even more important. And way back in 2014, Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything, about capitalism and climate chaos, she thought basic income was actually the place to start for addressing issues related to the climate, because in her mind, after 40 years of neoliberal kind of austerity mindedness, of individualism, of, you know, kind of radical individualism, basic income would be something that would give us a sense of the collective again, that we are all in the boat, in a boat together. I know, you know, maybe we're at maybe the better metaphor is that we're all in the same storm. We have different boats, but we're all in the same storm, whether that's COVID or whether that's the planetary destruction. So she thought that basic income was the place to start, because it would break the grip of neoliberalism on our collective imagination and give us that sense of collective. Because as she pointed out, that at this moment in time when we need collective action more than ever, we've had 40 years of a political philosophy that's reinforced individualism. So to my mind, that's a compelling argument that on the philosophical level, rather than the more practical or the policy level. To my mind, if it's done properly, if it's done well, basic income could be both a manifestation and also reinforce a different way of living together and living on the planet, that where we're not all out to scramble to the top and chase those, you know, those monetary rewards. It would be part of a whole change in how we live together. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you. I do want to move to allowing Anita to kind of garner some of the comments and questions, but just very, very quickly, a minute. If any of you wants to suggest a next step forward question, where might that be? Or what's the Kingston basic income group that you're part of? What are you thinking? Any ideas now? Suggestions? Help?
Well, I think we're going to be very kind of laser focused on the upcoming provincial election.
Okay.
You know, because we have, I mean, I'm not sure exactly what form that's going to take. We have the leader of the Liberal Party has said last weekend that he would reinstate the basic income pilot. I don't know what he means by that. but we have the Liberals very, clearly it was their project, and the Conservatives pulled the rug out from under it. So, we have a real kind of political battle potentially in this province about basic income. So, we should also mention that at the federal level, Prince Edward Island is actually just waiting for money from the federal government to implement not a pilot, but a basic income program in that province. So that's kind of exciting. All four political parties have agreed that they would support a basic income. There have been kind of proposals and models worked out, and they petitioned the federal government for money. They're really just waiting. And that's a really exciting development because like Saskatchewan, was the birthplace of Medicare, and we worked it out at provincial level. PEI would be a great place to work out all the kinks in the system. So then other provinces could see how it works. It wouldn't be nearly as expensive as doing it somewhere like Ontario. So, so there are some exciting developments. And yeah, both provincially and certainly in PEI.
Thank you so very much. I wonder now if it's just time to turn over to Anita and see if you're able to, I guess, collate some of the things that have been appearing in the chat.
So there seems to be a theme on some of these questions, and it is about the cost of a program such as this. So I'll give you an example of some of the questions. Basic income may cost a lot. How do you set the level that would be politically acceptable? And then there's another one that sounds kind of the same.
Actually, maybe Anita, I'll take a stab at that while
Sure,
you're
go ahead.
Just before the pandemic, actually, the Basic Income Canada network costed 3 different models for basic income, and what they found was that you could take the existing pot of tax dollars and make it more progressive and redistribute that without increasing taxes at all. So we talk about the cost of basic income, but we forget to think about the savings. I think someone in the chat pointed out that there'd be savings not just in social assistance. The Canadian Medical Association has estimated that up to 20% of our healthcare costs are directly related to poverty. Think about what the cost savings that could give us over time. The problem is that it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to happen probably over 20 years. Danielle Martin, who wrote the introduction to our book, has referring to the MinCom experiment in Manitoba in the 1970s, 8.5% reduction in hospitalization rates just in 4 years. She said, if that was a drug, we'd be putting it in the water if it could reduce hospitalizations by that amount. The savings in healthcare, I think, would be actually incredible. So they're buried, they're hidden costs. Also in education, also in the justice system, there'd be lots of money to save, but it's not going to happen in an electoral cycle, and it may be hard to trace 20 years down the road. So politicians want credit for the things that they do.
As I mentioned, the political cycle is a 4-year cycle, and to really seriously address the social determinants of health through basic income and other programs, the payoff, as Elaine says, is not nearly so, is not tomorrow. But I think that Elaine also mentioned the Basic Income Canada Network study that came out 2 months before the pandemic, which costed basic income and shows how it's affordable. It did predicate or base its assumptions on a thoroughgoing tax reform here in Canada. Canada, if we want to go back to 1972, when the United Church first came out for what was then called the Guaranteed Annual Income, We just had the Carter report that the Liberal government, no, I think it was the Diefenbaker government had commissioned. And the Carter Commission famously said a buck is a buck and argued for a much more equitable and fair taxation system in Canada. No government has seriously taken the Carter Commission at its word. So I think that was important. I think at the same time, the Senate Committee on Poverty, chaired by Senator David Kroll at the time, a former Liberal, came out for a guaranteed annual income only for people over 45. We'll have to stress, but they did come out for it. So just to show that, you know, with the United Church resolution, with the Kroll Commission, this has been on the table or the stove, but it's been, you know, it's been on the back burner and the burner's been turned off. But I think it's moved to the front, or it's moving toward the front. And I think that's really important. But we have to remember that, as Pope Francis said just this past Saturday, basic income is necessary, but it's not sufficient. It has to be accompanied by other public programs, programs of public provision, you know, taxation. Certainly in Canada, the shocking state of the housing market needs to be addressed. Childcare, which the Liberals have finally moved on, pharmacare, all these things, it has to be part of a package. Those of us who are promoting basic income are often criticized, you know, from the left as they claim that it's we see it as a silver bullet. It'll cure cancer and global warming or global climate breakdown, et cetera, et cetera. It's a caricature. It's you see that a lot. So the word canard is not just a French word for a duck.
Okay, I have another question here. Elaine Silverthorne asks, I work with a private company that is a certified living wage employer in Ontario. My question, where will employers fit into a government basic income plan?
Well, I think we have some evidence actually from MinCom as well that it put upward pressure on wages. And I think we could expect, as I said in my comments, that if workers could walk away from jobs that weren't paying a living wage, if they could walk away from those jobs, if they could walk away from unsafe jobs, I think employers will have to treat their workers better. They'll have to pay them better wages. They'll have to create safe working conditions. I just heard a little bit on the radio today about investigation into Amazon and the terrible working conditions that people have there. Those workers could demand more if they didn't, you know, I think it's Guy Standing who's called basic income a permanent strike fund. You know, it would allow workers to leave jobs that are where they're not treated well and where they're not paid well. So I think, you know, I'm glad that there are living wage employers, and I think all employers will have to become living wage employers if there's a permanent strike fund.
Okay, these two are kind of related. One wonders of the hidden benefits that counter the hidden costs. And then another question from another person, did the projects that tried GLI show medical cost reductions?
Sorry, Jamie, I'm just going to say one of the slag forward. One of the terrible the terrible losses of the cancellation of the pilot was the loss of these the data that would give us the answers to these questions. You know, there were literally people from all over the world watching that pilot and wondering what the results were going to be. It was a very rigorous evaluation built into the design of the program. There were questions that the participants had to answer about food insecurity, about housing, about their labor force attachment, about their use of there would be an examination of their medical, their use of hospitals and doctors. We would have that data. We would have it now, actually, if the pilot hadn't been canceled. So it was a terrible loss. Just all went in the garbage can. We have the baseline data. That's it. There was no other data could be collected because the government canceled it. So, sorry, I'm ranting now, but I'll stop there.
I told you it doesn't take long to get her going. I think one of the things that did follow from the cancellation of the Ontario Basic Income pilot was a study conducted by social scientists at McMaster University. They were able to do survey work with respect to people who'd been on basic income. They were able to do about 80 interviews with people who had been on basic income. And their report, which came out, I think it was in March it was just before the pandemic, in March of 2020. And you can find it just by searching for a McMaster report on basic income, showed that the effect of basic income on the people who were in receipt of it was, and the word they used was transformational, that the people on basic income had been liberated to spend more time looking for work, for upgrading, leaving one job and finding a better job. So contrary to what some people might think, there are indications that basic income really improved labor market outcomes to the extent that people were more eager and able to get in to the job market. So I think that's, as Elaine said, it was an opportunity lost, but these McMaster researchers who'd also done fabulous work over 10 years on precarious labor, they were able to follow up on a bit of the Ontario Basic Income pilot experience.
And if I could just add one comment about the hidden benefits. In Lindsay, when Jamie and I were there, we spoke with the director of the public housing corporation, who told us that because there were 2,000 people in Lindsay on basic income, and many of them were in rent geared to income housing. So of course their income went up, so their rent went up as well. And the housing corporation ended up with a $300,000 surplus that year, completely unexpected. No one anticipated that, but then they were able to take that money and reinvest it into the housing stock. So the idea of Lindsay, you can read about in the book how it came to be part of the pilot, but it was meant as a saturation site where most people in poverty were eligible, to try to get at some of the community-wide benefits and some of those unexpected benefits that like rent income surplus.
Someone asked, what do you think about a partial livable income, maybe just for those ages 18 to 65, as children and elders get a lot of help now?
Yeah, I think that's what we're proposing. Canada already has a basic income for children, the Canada Child Benefit, that came in 2015, that has helped a lot of people out, a lot of children and their parents out. So we cannot discount that. And as we've already stressed, those of us who are over 65, and again, I suspect it's many of us on this call, do get a basic income. No questions asked, unconditional. You hit 60, 65, you're eligible for the CPP, but that's of course contingent on your labor market performance over the state of your life, and certainly the old age security and the guaranteed income supplement. And I just want to add here, if I may, Anita, that people were talking about affordability, and I did pose the question early on about how much the Bank of Nova Scotia paid for the naming rights of the rink where the Wobegon Toronto Maple Leafs play. One person guessed 20 million, one guessed 30 million, and one guessed 50 million. Well, in fact, the answer is $800 million for the naming rights for that building. And that's only over a brief period, well, a few short years. And so number one has to ask, of course, that, you know, the money that the banks spend on the naming rights, the cost of doing business. So that's deducted from their taxes. And also in social terms, how many affordable housing units could $800 million build here in Canada? We're not talking about chump change here. So this is about, you know, the social control of wealth, or the lack of social control of wealth, and taxes and tax reform, et cetera, and ultimately the affordability of a program like a basic livable income. So that's my opportunity to rant. Usually I leave the ranting to Elaine.
I just put a link in the chat to the Basic Income Canada network, and someone said, you know, for the provincial election to create sound bites. And if you go to the Basic Income Canada network page, you'll see a little video there that was created for the federal election, but we'll be using it in the provincial election too. And it's from the Basic Income Now campaign. The little video is actually, I think it's like a minute and a half, and it's very inspiring. It's one of those things I'll turn to on the days when I'm feeling discouraged. So take a look. It's great, actually. So
do we have time for more questions? I am Ellie or Clarke, or
Hard to say. I'm not sure how people feel. Virginia was going to wind up with just a few minutes. So I would say, sure, another question or two.
Sure. So Anne Marie asks, she says the Federal Parliamentary Budget Office posted this report. It's a PDF called Basic Income Costing. She says, as I recall, the report says that basic income only reduces hours of work by 1 to 2%. Do you know about this?
yeah, there's actually been a research study that was done in 2018 that looked at basic income pilots around the world. And at most it reduces labor force participation by about 5%. This was, I think it was 15 or 16 different pilots or experiments around the world. The author concluded that, you know, it's a negligible effect on labor force participation. And the people, what we saw in MinCom in the 70s was there were two groups that had lower labor force participation. One group was young men who decided to finish high school instead of quitting to find work to help support their families. We know as a social determinant of health that finishing high school, that's a good thing. And the other group were new mothers who decided to stay home and look after their children. And we also know that's a really good thing. So generally what these pilots or experiments show is that people make good decisions. They might drop out of the labor force so they can upgrade their education, so they can get a better job. So they might stay home to look after an elderly parent or young ones, but they make the best decision based on a broad assessment of the circumstances of their lives. So that's been found over and over and over again.
And I think just very briefly, Anita, that Elaine just made the point about trust. And so I think we have to trust each other. So our current welfare systems are based entirely on the notion of the undeserving poor, and these people are not to be trusted, and their lives have to be scrutinized, surveilled, and policed as much as possible. And one of the things that the basic income guarantee, the basic livable income would do, would be reflect a greater social trust. And it would also free up the people who are working as welfare cops to really spend more of their time doing what they probably signed up to do when they took social service in college or university, and that's to help people who are in desperate need of help. People are struggling with mental illness, addiction, that kind of thing. So, okay, I'll stop there.
Okay, so Ellie and Clarke, it is now 8:23. Do you want to wrap things up for 8:30?
Could I just add one other thing? There's a comment, the last comment. Sorry, yeah, Jamie's laughing. I could talk about basic income for hours, so I just have to pull me off the stage. But I just wanted to say that I think the United Church campaign for guaranteed livable income is a better naming. I think if I were starting all over again, I would be calling it guaranteed livable income rather than a basic income, because one of the things that's happened, the idea of basic income has become so big and covers so many things that it's not always clear that we're talking about a livable income. And so what's happening in the United States, for example, is that there are little pilots happening with $300, $400, $500 a month. And that makes a huge difference for the people who receive it, but it's not enough to live on. So I really commend the United Church for that naming of what we're calling a basic income. We mean it as a basic livable, enough to live on. So thank you.
And just briefly, the Ontario Basic Income pilot, I think it topped out at $17,000 a year, whereas the CERB topped out at $24,000 a year. So I don't think you can really afford to live in a big Canadian city on $17,000. You'd be still struggling on $24,000, but it's certainly more respectable.
Okay, thank you. Thank you both.
Yes.
I'll stop now. I'm going to mute myself.
So can we go back to Joe? Does he have any final words of wrapping up?
Well, just
You're muted.
hit that. Just like to express
You think
thanks.
you would have learned by now.
Oh dear. The things you have to let go. Thanks to Jamie and to Elaine. Real thanks to Elaine for trying to keep Jamie in check. I know it's not easy, but this is actually a very wonderful conversation. Thanks to all the people that put questions in there. This is an ongoing struggle and issue, as we have seen. So it's really wonderful that people continue to find ways to talk about it. And I think the fact that the two of you did some good work with looking into the real lives of people who were so excited by the pilot that Ontario ran for a while, and then tried to draw the lessons out of that. That's a real contribution that I think is goes beyond what we've seen in the literature for quite some time. I know that Jamie has done some of this work before in the books that have been done through the in Ontario with some of the listening to folks in poverty that church groups have done for years and years, but it's this is a new step forward. So thanks to you, and thanks to the folks that organized this evening as a chance to share some of the good stuff that's in this really quite wonderful book that I encourage everyone to keep chatting about. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Joel. Now we call on Virginia.
Yes. Okay. Thanks, Ellie. Good evening. Wow, that was a wonderful discussion, and I'm sure we could have continued even much longer. I'm honored to have the privilege of thanking our presenters and others involved in this evening's event. Personally, I am relatively new to the concept of a basic income or guaranteed livable income. For several decades, my church, Trinity United in Ottawa, has had a committee that explores pressing social justice issues, seeking to learn more and take some constructive action. For the last couple of years, we have focused on various aspects of poverty, including a basic income as part of a possible solution. We have attended talks, including by Senator Kim Pate, researched, written a primer for the congregation, and hosted a Zoom event this past February with Evelyn Forget. As the Liberal Policy Convention approached last spring, we wrote letters and contacted MPs by phone. I was delighted to hear from Clarke and Ellie Topp this past summer about a new book, The Case for a Basic Income, by Jamie Swift and Elaine Power, and that they hope to organize an event to hear from Jamie and Elaine about their findings. We thought that the timing of the event close to the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty, October 17th, was quite apropos. And so here we are. We've had a very informative and inspirational evening. In reading the book, I found the history of the basic income movement very interesting. I'm amazed at how long and in how many countries people have been working towards this. As Jamie says, the democratization of prosperity. I was particularly moved by the personal stories of some individuals involved in the aborted Ontario pilots, of how much this extra and steady income helped them, and sadly, the devastating effects of its premature cancellation. It makes me wonder, with the CERB and other federal government support programs ending, if we will see a similar negative effect. A huge thank you to Jamie and Elaine for your research, your informative book, for raising our awareness, and for generously sharing your time and expertise with us this evening. You certainly have made a solid case for a basic income, have encouraged us to engage in active hope. Thanks also to the very Reverend Lois Wilson for your wisdom and your leadership on this issue for over many years. Thanks to Joe for shepherding us through the evening and for your humor and insightful questions. Thanks also to Anita for dealing with the many technical aspects for us. And a big thanks to Clarke and Ellie for your decades of work promoting a guaranteed livable income in the Ottawa area, and for your persistence in getting this event organized. It's unfortunate that Kendall David of Basic Income Canada Youth Network is ill and was not able to join us this evening, but it is encouraging that youth groups are working to promote the cause. This is certainly an intergenerational movement. I think that this is an exciting time for the basic income cause. The federal government pandemic support programs have raised public awareness of the need to help those whose income is insufficient or precarious, and the huge benefits to health and other areas that result. The idea has become more mainstream and has made its way onto the Liberal policy agenda, and was spoken about at length by Annemie Paul during the leaders' debate. Thanks to all of you for attending this evening and for your interest in this issue. As people have been doing for many years, we can advance the cause by learning, as we did this evening, spreading the word, and letting those with the power to make this happen know that this is what is needed and what is right. Thank you and good evening.